Of all the people that you'd expect to be racked by scandal, President Grover Cleveland is not exactly one of those that would immediately be high up there on your list. And yes, for anyone curious, I am talking about that Grover Cleveland, the only president in US history who was able to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. See, the funny thing is, he had actually won the popular vote back in the elections of 1884, 1888, and 1892. However, among all of those, he only actually won the overall election of 1884 and 1892. The funny thing is, when we talk about the guy, history generally remembers Cleveland as a man who was honorable and a fairly good president. During his first term, he appointed candidates based on their merit and not just on a party basis. He also reduced the total number of federal employees in order to try and make sure to balance the budget and not unnecessarily use public funds. He simultaneously made many different reforms in terms of foreign policy, currency, coins, tariffs, you name it. He moved to fix it. And for years, even before becoming president, he would oftentimes fight corruption, both in the office once he actually was president and when he was simply a governor, a mayor, a sheriff, fixing many of the issues that for years had plagued New York. He was not exactly someone that you'd expect to be wrapped up here in a sex scandal, but that is precisely what happened, and in easily one of the most disgusting ways possible, it seems. But we're gonna need to break down that story here because the entire thing is honestly a bit of a mess. You see, my friends, the story begins on July 8th, 1884. At the time, the Democratic Party delegates had gathered in Chicago in order to nominate a candidate for president, and Grover Cleveland was the guy who was expected to win. At the time, he had been governor of New York and had been doing a pretty bang-up job, it seems. So much so that he was very popular and was expected to be the person that was picked, and also from that, have a pretty strong chance at winning the overall election. The other candidate at the time that he was running against was the Republican nominee James G. Blaine, who was the former House Speaker, Senator, and Secretary of State, and that guy, well, they thought that they had a pretty good chance against winning against him because he had been wrapped up in his own kind of political scandals, including accepting bribes for different positions and things that really didn't exactly put him in a good light. So at the time, everything seemed good, but then came the bombshell. Several days after the Democratic Convention, the Buffalo Evening Telegraph would publish an expose titled "A Terrible Tale, a Dark Chapter in a Public Man's History," which revealed that there was a secret that Cleveland had been hiding over the course of his life. The article alleged that Cleveland was actually the father of a 9-year-old illegitimate child, and that he had been paying the mother for years in order to keep her quiet. A woman by the name of Maria Halpin. Of course, for the supporters of Blaine, who had been looking for something to attack Cleveland with, a man who had been posing himself as honorable and upright, this seemed to be too perfect to be true. So immediately, they started rallying against him, reciting different things in jeers such as, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" A campaign jeer that would be seen for months along the trail as each candidate was trying to drum up votes. Now, mind you, I'm going to say this right now, but when we're talking about powerful men in history, as I'm sure that many of you already know all too well, there have been many instances of these guys having illegitimate children, and in most cases, it's not really a problem. Yes, there are things where it will negatively affect them, but in most cases in history, when you are a powerful person in politics, generally speaking, you're able to get away with a little bit more. This case, though, in history is a little bit different, though, because it's, much darker. Cleveland's campaign, knowing that there was no real way that they were going to be able to refute these allegations, was almost blasé in the fact that they admitted, yeah, Cleveland and Halpin had been in an illicit relationship, and at the time the campaign gave a very simple rationale for all of this. Cleveland, at that point in history, was a bachelor, he wasn't married, and Halpin had apparently been rather free with her affections, if you want to use that term. According to the campaign, the people that she was free with her affections with included some of Cleveland's friends, including prominent Buffalo businessmen, just simply all over the place. And because Cleveland was the only guy among all of them that was unmarried, when it was discovered that she was pregnant, he went and took responsibility for the entire thing, even though he was not actually certain that the child was his. But it's okay, because he was going to claim paternity and simultaneously help Halpin name the boy and place him with a loving and caring family that would be able to raise him. Really, he'd only been looking out for his friends and also to take care of a woman who was in a very unfortunate circumstance. Yes, of course, the scandal for a campaign was unfortunate, true, but the governor's involvement in the entire thing wasn't nefarious. In fact, he was actually helping a woman. Nevertheless, the newspapers, of course, still ran with the story, and it was only a matter of time before reporters started finding Halpin's actual whereabouts and getting her side of the story for what had happened. And her tale, well, that was something that was going to differ from Cleveland's very substantially. On October 31st, 1884, in an interview with the Chicago Tribune, she would proclaim, "The circumstances under which my ruin were accomplished are too revolting on part of Grover Cleveland to be made public." In her her version of the events, she wasn't some fallen woman who had been sleeping around and Grover Cleveland effectively took pity on her and helped her raise this child. Far from it. No, instead, she was a 38-year-old widow who was employed as a clerk in a Buffalo department store when she encountered the hefty young lawyer by the name of Grover Cleveland. According to Halpin, Cleveland at the time had been an ardent suitor of hers. He really wanted her, and despite the fact that she wasn't really interested in him, he would pursue her relentlessly over the course of their history together. She would describe him as having off-putting zeal. Either way, her story of the event says that she was on her way to a friend's birthday party when Cleveland ran into her on the street. He insisted that she had to join him for dinner, and even though she didn't want to at first, he was so insistent that she eventually agreed. So accompanying him, she went to the Ocean Dining Hall and Oyster House, where, by her own account, Halpin says that she actually did kind of enjoy their dinner together. It is what happened afterwards that would become a big problem, because according to her, what happened is that Cleveland would escort her back to the boarding house where she resided, and events would take a turn for the worse. He all but forced himself inside of the room and had his way with her. And although she would not charge him after the fact with sexual assault or anything worse, she would state that the encounter was not consensual and that afterwards he had said that if she went to the police or anyone of authority, that he would ruin her. And mind you, at the time, this is not an idle threat. As the former sheriff of Erie County, Cleveland still had a lot of friends inside of law enforcement. And considering his current political power and position, there really wasn't anything that she would be able to do about this. No doubt anyone that she would talk to in any kind of real position of power would end up believing his word over hers. And so fearful that she was going to be retaliated against, she just didn't say anything to anyone. She kept it hidden. At the same time, she would tell Cleveland that after the whole incident, she never wanted to see him again. But unfortunately for her, 5 to 6 weeks later, she was forced to because, as it turns out, she was pregnant. Maria would not lose the child, and the pregnancy would advance as expected, and Maria Halpin would end up bearing a son in a hospital for unwed mothers on September 14th, 1874. The boy at the time being named Oscar Folsom Cleveland, this being actually after Grover Cleveland's best friend at the time, who, ironically enough, as a little side detail here, Grover Cleveland would later marry that friend's daughter, despite the fact that she was significantly younger than him. We're talking 30-year difference, I think, at the time. She became the youngest first lady ever. As for Halpin herself, she was horrified when her child was spirited away from her, and she was then forced into the Providence Lunatic Asylum, which, as the name implies, was a hospital for people that were thought to be insane. All of this apparently had been done at the behest of Grover Cleveland, who had sent men in order to make this happen, and Halpin would insist that no, she was not unbalanced, that her son had been snatched from her, and this entire thing was a plot specifically meant to make her look bad, to punish her, and make sure that she wouldn't be able to speak out to the public. She would actually only reside in the asylum for a couple days before doctors sat down and realized, hey, wait a minute, hold on. She's not actually crazy. What is going on? And so after only a little bit of time, she ended up being released, and anxious to track down her boy after this, she hired a Buffalo attorney by the name of Milo A. Whitney to help her track down her son and get him back. And outraged for how she had been treated by Cleveland, she ended up filing charges of assault and abduction against him, and her brother-in-law would come down from New Jersey in order to be able to help her in her case. Within days, according to Halpin, she received a proposed agreement that offered her $500, which if you do the math, we're talking about something along the lines of 13 grand, which is not amazing, but it is kind of decent hush money, I guess. But she was offered this amount if she would agree to relinquish custodial rights to the boy and drop the matter entirely. And without the financial or political or contacts or any other kind of means by which she would be able to fight Cleveland, she would reluctantly agree to this. A doctor back at the Providence Lunatic Asylum would then later adopt her son. Over the course of the following years, she would watch as Cleveland's political career would gradually progress, and when reporters came in calling in the summer of 1884 in order to investigate Grover the Good's unsavory past, well, Maria was really pissed off that the way that they were portraying her was as a harlot. The campaign that Cleveland was running at the time was saying that not only was she a harlot, but that she was a heavy drinker, she was prone to insanity, she was neglectful to her own child, that everything that Cleveland had been doing was trying to help her in the first place. Per her own words, the campaign tale was more than the usual embroidery of truth, she said. Of course, the tragic part about all of this is that none of this really does matter. Not surprisingly, what would happen from this is that public opinion would follow the predictable patterns that you would see in any kind of political election or issue. Democratic partisans would express their support for the nominee, praising his heroic efforts to cure this unstable harlot and take care of this bastard child that they didn't even know was actually his. And others, even if they believed her, would say, oh, well, these were just the hijinks of some youthful boy, something to be forgotten about. A whole boys will be boys kind of thing, if you will. Which, mind you, at the time that we're talking about this, Grover Cleveland was almost 40 years old. So even if you are a person who advocates for the whole thing of boys will be boys, or however you want to say it, that is most certainly not something that would apply at this point in his life. Republicans, on the other hand, would desperately hold on to this because they needed any possible ammunition that they could have against Cleveland. After all, the way that he was always presented to the press was someone who was unfailingly honest in comparison to the corrupt James Blaine. And so according to them, considering his past and how he was trying to frame this whole thing, well, that was not a person who could possibly be president. At the very least, the premarital sex that James Blaine had been a part of resulted in him marrying his bride. The story or background to that is that she would end up actually giving birth 3 months after they were married. So you go ahead and do the math. Either way, we kind of already know how this whole thing ends. Cleveland would end up eking out a victory over Blaine on November 4th, 1884, but he would win by only around 23,000 votes. Mind you, we're talking about out of over 10 million votes. So he barely won the popular vote, and then out of the Electoral College, Cleveland won 219 votes in 20 states to his opponent's 182 votes and 18 states. He was the first Democratic nominee to win the election of president since the Civil War of almost 20 years earlier. At the time, there was this whole jeer that the Republicans had been using against him over the course of his campaign trail that said, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" You know, something that was referring to the whole illegitimate child that he had and the issues of like trying to deny it. To which, after the election had happened, his supporters then turned around and went, "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House. Ha ha ha." Which is stupid, but honestly, that whole thing is a little funny at least. There was even another jeer that they used at the time, which was, "Hurrah for Maria, hurrah for the kid. I voted for Cleveland, and I'm damn glad that I did." Which is actually something that ended up naming Maria in person, something that she never actually wanted. It was just something that drummed her more into the spotlight than she had any wish to. And as for what actually happened with Maria and her child after all of this, well, the reality is that for her child, Oscar Folsom Cleveland would pretty much fade from the public record. It is possible that later on he went and changed his name and would go on to become a New York gynecologist, but we don't really know this. And as for Maria, she would eventually remarry and live out the rest of her life in relative peace and isolation. This being until she would die in the year 1902 without ever having actually seen her son again. According to her obituary, her last wish was that her funeral just please not be made public because, quote, "for she dreaded having strangers look curiously upon her dead face." The only thing that she wanted at that point was peace. The unfortunate thing is that in the end, we're never actually going to know the absolute truth of what happened in this entire tale. This is a story that I'm sure not many people are familiar with, and the reason why I wanted to bring it to your all's attention is because the podcast episode that we're doing this week for the History of Everything podcast is specifically on presidential sex scandals, of which we have an audiobook for that we're doing as part of the book club. So hey, if you want to support this channel, if you want to check all that out, then please check the links down in my description below. You can check out the podcast, you can check out my coffee, you can check out Patreon, and you can check out this month's audiobook club. Thank you, everyone, for all of your support, and I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what we should do in the comment section below next. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Goodbye, guys.